My daughter-in-law was standing in her laundry room with her arms wrapped around her own ribs like she was holding herself together by hand. And 30 feet away in the kitchen, she and my son had spent a year making theirs. Another woman was humming to herself while she rearranged a spice rack that wasn't hers to rearrange. I didn't know yet that it had been going on for 11 days. I didn't know that within the week I'd be sitting in a hospital waiting room at 2 a.m, gripping a styrofoam cup of vending machine coffee so hard the seams split, thinking about the last time a hospital hallway had looked exactly like that one. I didn't know that all of it. The suitcases, the borrowed cardigan, the woman crying into a stack of clean towels would eventually come down to one small, unspoken act of defiance. A dozen spice jars moved 4 feet to the left without a word of explanation to anyone. All I knew, standing in that doorway with my overnight bag still on my shoulder and my bad hip aching from 2 hours in the car, was that my son's house didn't feel like his house anymore, and it didn't feel like hers either. Let me back up. It started 3 weeks earlier with a phone call I almost let go to voicemail. "Mom," Ryan said, and I heard it before he even finished the word. That small catch of breath he's had since he was 9 years old, the one he got right before he told me he'd broken the kitchen window with a baseball and didn't know how to say it. "Don't be upset." "I'm already upset," I told him. That's what happens when someone says don't be upset before they've told you anything. He laughed a little nervously, and then he told me. Paige's father needed a procedure on his heart, a catheterization, nothing dangerous the way Ryan explained it, more of a look and see than a repair. But he'd need monitoring afterward, and Sandra didn't drive on highways, and the specialist was in Richmond, 20 minutes from Ryan and Paige's place, and 40 from anyone in the family back home in Farmville. So Harold and Sandra were coming to stay. "Just for a while," Ryan said, "just until Harold was cleared." "Of course," I said, "because what else do you say?" "That makes sense." I live 2 hours away in the same town I've called home for 31 years. My husband, Frank, died 4 years ago, and I still keep our house almost exactly as it was, partly out of habit and partly because some evenings, if I don't turn on too many lights, it still smells faintly of him near the back closet, and I'm in no hurry for that particular kind of quiet to end. I want to explain something about Ryan and Paige's house, too, because it matters to what follows. 3 years ago, when Ryan was getting his renovation business off the ground and couldn't qualify for enough on his own, I put $60,000 toward the down payment. I want to be precise about that. I contributed. I didn't give because it mattered to me then, and it still does now. Paige worked pediatric nursing shifts that started before sunrise. Between the two of them, they found a squat brick colonial in Midlothian with good bones and a maple tree out back, and I helped Paige paint the guest room, a soft sage green, the week they moved in. Ryan got paint on his left ear and didn't notice until dinner. I remember thinking, watching him eat with green flecked into his hairline, this is what it looks like when things go right. I drove down about once a month after that, usually for a long weekend, sleeping in the sage green room under the window that looked out at the maple. Paige would leave coffee waiting on the counter before her shift, in the blue mug she knew I liked, without ever being asked. That was her way. Quiet, practical kindness. She didn't make declarations. She just did things. Her name is Paige, and I want to say that plainly, because in the version of this story where she disappears into my son's wife, she gets lost. She doesn't deserve to get lost, not in her own house and not in the telling of it. When I pulled into the driveway that November, there were 2 cars I didn't recognize, a silver Buick and a dark green SUV with a cracked taillight angled in at the curb like they'd been there long enough to stop being careful about it. I parked on the street. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual, but I knocked anyway out of habit and let myself in. There was a suitcase sitting open against the wall by the coat closet, clothes folded loosely inside like whoever packed it expected to need them again soon. A pair of men's slippers sat on the entry mat. The wrong mat. Paige kept a braided oval rug there, the one her grandmother had made her, soft blues and creams gone a little flat with age. This was a thick rubber-backed thing, the kind you buy off a rack at a hardware store. I stood there a moment with my bag still on my shoulder, looking at that mat like it might explain itself. Then I heard voices from the kitchen. There were 4 people at the table. My son, Paige's younger sister, Erica, whom I'd met once, briefly, at the wedding, and 2 people I didn't know at all. A tall man with a gray crew cut and tired eyes, and a woman with the same dark, sharp gaze Paige had, and the same way of sitting very straight, like she'd been taught it was rude not to. Ryan stood up fast when he saw me. Too fast. There was relief on his face that didn't belong there, not for a simple hello. "Mom, hey, this is Harold and Sandra, Paige's parents, and you remember Erica." Harold's catheterization had gone well, he told me, gripping my hand with a firm, careful shake. Sandra had come along to help him manage the follow-up, and somehow, nobody quite explained how, Erica had come too and was staying in the guest room. "Where would I be staying?" I asked. Nobody answered right away. Ryan looked at the table. "We set you up on the sectional," Sandra said brightly, like she was offering me something generous. "Down in the basement. It pulls all the way out. Very comfortable." I'm 63 years old. I have a bad hip from a fall in my garden 2 summers ago that still complains when the weather turns. I said that to no one in particular, mostly because I needed to say something, and then I said I'd figure it out. I picked my bag back up because apparently I'd be needing it elsewhere, and I went to find my daughter-in-law. She was in the laundry room, a narrow space off the side of the kitchen with just enough room for the washer, the dryer, and a shelf of detergent Paige kept lined up by size. She was leaning back against the dryer with her arms crossed over her chest, and she'd been crying, not in that moment, but recently enough that her face still remembered it. That particular tightness around the eyes that doesn't go away just because the tears have stopped. I shut the door behind me. "Paige, I'm so sorry about the room. I told him you should have the guest room. I really did. But Erica said she gets motion sick on the pull-out and—" "Carol, don't apologize to me. Tell me what's going on." "Paige, it's fine. Dad's recovery is going well. It's just—" "Carol, Paige." She looked down at the floor, soft gray linoleum with a thin white vein running through it. The same flooring we'd picked out together at the home improvement store on a Saturday 2 summers back, arguing cheerfully over 3 nearly identical samples. She told me finally, in a voice so quiet I had to lean in to catch it. Her mother had moved the spice rack to the other side of the stove. Better light, she'd said, for reading the labels. Her mother had reorganized the pantry by a logic only she understood. Her mother had commented, "Just an observation, nothing pointed," on the thread count of the guest room sheets and on the fact that there wasn't any bread in the house, since Paige and Ryan had been eating mostly grain-free for the better part of a year. And Erica had borrowed Paige's good cardigan without asking and spilled something down the sleeve. She told me all of it like she was reciting a grocery list. Small, flat, unimportant. That was almost the worst part. "Carol, how long have they been here?" "Paige, 11 days. I sat down on the edge of the washing machine. It was cool and solid under me, and I was grateful for something to hold still against. "Carol, how long are they staying?" "Paige, Mom mentioned Thanksgiving." A short, humorless laugh. "Which is 3 weeks away." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I asked if she'd talked to Ryan about it. "Paige, he's trying. He's really trying. She stopped herself. "My mother is very good at making everything sound reasonable. One thing at a time. Nothing major. Always a good explanation. The spice rack makes more sense by the window. More light. The sheets were just an observation. The bread was just a question. Carol, I know that pattern. She looked at me then, really looked for the first time since I'd walked in, and I saw something in her face I recognized because I'd worn it myself decades before she was born. It's the look of someone who's been talked out of her own irritation so many times that she started to wonder if the irritation was ever real to begin with. Carol. It's real, Paige. She laughed again, the short kind, and wiped her face with the back of her hand and said she needed to start dinner. I told her I'd help. When we came back into the kitchen, Sandra was already at the stove. She'd found a pot from the back of a cabinet, not where Paige kept her pots, and was heating oil in it, humming something I didn't recognize under her breath. Paige stood in the doorway of her own kitchen and watched another woman cook at her stove without having been asked. I thought I'd get something started, Sandra said, not turning around. Nobody had, and it's getting late. She mentioned a recipe, something about a cousin who made it differently, something about the Sundays when her own children were young. Paige said that sounded nice and went to set the table. I helped her set the table. I didn't say much through dinner. I was too busy watching. Part 3. Dinner that night was pleasant in the specific, exhausting way that requires everyone to work very hard at it. Harold asked me polite questions about my drive. Erica scrolled her phone under the table, not quite hiding it. Ryan talked too much about a job he'd just closed, a kitchen gut and rebuild out in Chesterfield, filling silences before they could stretch too long. Sandra's dish was good. I'll say that plainly, because it's true, and because none of what I'm telling you is about her cooking. It was good. Everyone said so. Paige ate 3 bites and pushed the rest around her plate. There weren't enough chairs, so I stood at the counter with mine and told everyone not to worry about it, and I meant it mostly. That night, I drove to the Hampton Inn 7 minutes away and paid for my own room on my own card because the alternative was a pulled-out sectional in a basement I'd have to navigate in the dark with a hip that hated stairs. And because, more than that, I needed a door I could close. I lay on the hotel bed with the television off and the highway hum coming faint through the window, and I thought about my son and whether he understood what was happening in his own house. I thought about the laundry room, the spice rack, the cardigan with something dark down the sleeve. I called him a little after 9. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting for it. Ryan, hey, Mom, you get settled at the hotel okay? Carol, Ryan, do you see what's happening in your house? A pause, long enough that I could hear a television murmuring behind him, some sports recap he wasn't watching. Ryan, her dad just had a procedure. Her parents are going through something hard. I don't want to make it worse. Carol, I understand that. So is your wife going through something hard, and she lives there. Another pause. Ryan, I know. Carol, good, then act like it. I didn't sleep well. My hip ached from the drive and the unfamiliar mattress, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Paige in that laundry room, arms crossed, face arranged into something that was trying very hard to pass for fine. Somewhere near midnight, I finally slept, but not before deciding that whatever tomorrow brought, I wasn't going to spend the rest of this visit being a polite house guest about it. Part 4. In the morning, Sandra was at the kitchen table with coffee and her phone when I came in. She looked up and asked pleasantly if I'd slept well at the hotel. The word hotel had a small edge tucked into it, not sharp enough to call out, just sharp enough to know it was there. I told her I'd slept fine, thank you, and asked where Paige was. Out walking, Sandra said. She goes for walks when she's in a mood. I poured myself coffee and stood at the counter, looking out at the backyard, at the bird feeder near the maple that Paige kept stocked through every season. She'd told me once that cardinals mate for life, and that the pair that came to that feeder every winter was the same pair, year after year. I'd thought about that for days after she said it. The idea of choosing the same small, unremarkable branch over and over because it was yours. Sandra started talking about Ryan's business, how it was still new, still finding its feet, how it was a lot of risk for a young family to carry. She said it all in a tone that was technically kind, the way a splinter is technically small. Then she mentioned the neighborhood, good schools, safe streets, and said she'd told Paige as much when they were house hunting, as though the house had been her idea to begin with. I turned around. Carol, it's a wonderful house. My son and Paige looked for months to find the right one. I was glad they had support from both families, getting it done. Sandra, of course. She smiled when she said it. I didn't smile back, but I didn't say anything sharper either. Not yet. I found Paige on the back step instead of on a walk, sitting with a mug in both hands, looking at the feeder. I sat beside her. My hip complained about the step the way it complains about most things lately, and for a minute neither of us said anything. I'm sorry you had to get a hotel, she said finally. I'm going to say something, I told her, and I want you to hear all of it before you apologize for anything else. She nodded, and I said it plainly. This was her house, not her mother's kitchen, hers. And because I wanted her to have the whole picture, I told her I had some financial stake in it too. Not to hold over her, not to create some debt she owed me, but so she'd understand there was someone else in her corner who wasn't willing to pretend any of this was normal. Paige held her mug with both hands and looked at the maple, mostly bare by then, just a few stubborn brown leaves still hanging on. Paige, I know it's not normal. I know that. I just don't know how to say it without starting a war. Carol, wars usually start because one side won't admit there's already a conflict. The war is already here, Paige. The only question is whether you're going to be in it. She was quiet a long time. Paige, what would you do? I thought about that longer than she probably expected me to. I thought about my own mother-in-law decades ago now, a woman named Ruth, who used to rearrange my kitchen cabinets whenever she visited and call it helping, and how it took me the better part of 8 years, 8 years I'll never get back, to learn how to put a lid on a jar and set it down somewhere else without asking permission first. I thought about Frank and how he never once raised his voice at anyone in his life, and how much I admired that about him, and how many years it took him to understand that his silence, however kind, wasn't the same thing as protection. I didn't tell Paige all of that. Not then, but I told her the shape of it. Carol, I'd start with one room. She looked at me. Carol, start with the spice rack. Put it back where you had it. Paige, just move it? Carol, today, while your mother's in the living room, don't announce it, don't explain it, just move it back and see what happens. She didn't answer right away. Carol, you've been managing her feelings about your house for 11 days, Paige. She can manage her feelings about your kitchen for 11 minutes. That was the first time I heard her laugh for real, not the short, tired sound from the laundry room, but something with actual air behind it. I want to say something here about the days that followed, because I made a decision that morning I hadn't planned on making. I'd come for a long weekend the way I always did, down Thursday, home Sunday, 4 days, the same rhythm I'd kept for 3 years. Standing on that back step, I understood I wasn't leaving Sunday. I called my neighbor, Diane, and asked her to collect my mail and keep an eye on the porch for a stray cat that had taken to sleeping under it, and I didn't think twice about either request. Whatever this was going to take, I intended to be there for it. Part 5. That afternoon, I was in the living room with a magazine I wasn't really reading when I heard it, the small scrape of wood against countertop, quick and quiet. Then nothing. Then Sandra's voice from somewhere down the hall. What was that sound? I moved the spices back, Paige called out, perfectly steady. I've always kept them there. It's how I cook. A pause. Oh, she just thought the light was better on the other side, Sandra said to no one in particular, to the air. I appreciate that, Paige said. I'm going to keep them where I put them. I sat very still and looked at a page of a magazine I couldn't have described to you 5 seconds later. It was one spice rack, a dozen jars, maybe more. But when Paige came around the corner a few minutes later, there was something different in her face. Not triumph, exactly. More like recognition. Like she'd found something in a drawer she'd assumed was gone for good. That evening, Ryan came home to 5 people in the house and not enough chairs, and I ate standing at the counter again and didn't make an issue of it. Harold, tired-eyed and careful in his movements, asked me what I'd done for work before I retired, and I asked him instead about the knob and tube wiring still running through the back bedroom of my house, a question I'd been meaning to ask an electrician for 2 years. He answered it fully, thoughtfully, sketching the layout on a napkin with a pen from his shirt pocket. And for 10 minutes at that crowded table, it was just two people talking about wiring, and it was a relief. After dinner, Paige washed dishes. Sandra came to help and suggested a different way to rinse. "I know," Paige said. "I like doing it this way." That was all. No apology tacked onto the end of it. Sandra went to the living room to watch television, and I saw something pass over Harold's face that I couldn't quite name yet. Something between pride and worry, like he wasn't sure which one he was allowed to feel. Over the next 3 days, I watched my daughter-in-law learn how to take up space in her own life again. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a single confrontation. It was Paige taking her cardigan back from Erica's room without making a production of it and hanging it in her own closet. It was Paige meal planning the week around the grain-free approach she and Ryan preferred and making her parents a separate, simple pasta on the side without narrating it as a compromise or an apology. It was Paige staying in the room when her mother started in about the house instead of finding a reason to leave it. Sandra adjusted, not gracefully. There were still comments, still a pointed remark now and then about how things were done in a household she'd run for 30 years. But she adjusted. On the third evening, Ryan came and sat across from me in the living room and didn't say anything for a while. Then Ryan, "I think I let this go sideways." Carol, "You did." Ryan, "I kept thinking if I just stayed neutral, it would work itself out. I read something once about how conflict between in-laws resolves faster if you don't escalate." Carol, "That's true when there's an actual conflict happening on both sides. This wasn't that. This was one person making steady adjustments to a life someone else built, and the other person shrinking to fit around it. There's nothing to de-escalate when only one side is doing the escalating." He was quiet. Carol, "You need to talk to her parents, kindly, but directly. You need a date." Ryan, "We never set a firm one." Carol, "I know." Ryan, "Sandra's going to take it personally." Carol, "She might." I let that sit a second. "Your wife's already taking something personally, Ryan. She just hasn't said so because she loves you and she doesn't want to be the reason you have a hard conversation." He looked up at me. "I've known that boy 34 years. I know exactly which sentences land on him and which ones bounce off." That one landed. Part 6. A couple of evenings later, we were finishing dinner. Paige's grain-free lasagna, which Sandra had eaten 2 helpings of without commenting on it once, which I noticed because by then I was noticing everything, when Harold set down his fork and pressed the back of his hand flat against his sternum, very calmly, the way you'd check a stovetop you thought might still be warm. "Harold," Sandra said, "just tight," he said. "Probably ate too fast." But his color had changed, gone the pale gray of old dishwater, and there was a thin sheen at his hairline that hadn't been there a minute before. And Paige, who spends her working life reading exactly this kind of small physical evidence in people too young to describe what they're feeling, was already up and beside him before the rest of us had fully understood something was wrong. Paige, "Dad, look at me. Can you take a full breath?" He tried. It didn't go all the way down. Paige told Ryan to call 911, not ask, not suggest, call them now, and told her mother, gently but without room for negotiation, to get Harold's medication bottles from the guest room so she'd have them ready for the paramedics. Sandra stood frozen for one long second, staring at her husband's face like she was trying to memorize it, and then she moved. I have sat in exactly one hospital waiting room at 2 a.m. before in my life. 4 years ago when a call came about Frank, and time does not make that particular kind of waiting any easier. It only makes you more familiar with the shape of it. the fluorescent light humming too loud, the vending machine with its one broken button, your own heartbeat suddenly very loud in your ears. Ryan drove Harold and Paige following the ambulance. I drove Sandra and Erica in my car, and Sandra sat in the passenger seat with her hands pressed flat together in her lap like she was praying without the words for it. And about 10 minutes from the hospital, she said very quietly, "Not really to me. Sandra, I wasn't there. When my mother went, they sent me to my aunt's for 2 weeks because I was 14 and they said it wasn't a place for a child. And by the time anyone let me back in the house, it was already..." She stopped herself, straightened her spine the way Paige does, the way I imagine Sandra's own mother probably did. She didn't finish the sentence, and I didn't ask her to. At the hospital, we waited 3 hours. Harold's heart rhythm had gone briefly erratic. Nothing catastrophic, the doctor told us eventually. A wiry young cardiologist who looked barely older than Ryan, but worth catching and worth treating, and worth the fear it had put into all of us in the meantime. They'd adjust his medication. They wanted him overnight for monitoring, and then he could go home, or rather, back to Ryan and Paige's, which had been serving as home for 3 weeks by then. Sandra cried when they told her he was stable, hard enough that Erica had to hold onto her arm, and it wasn't performance. I've watched enough performance grief in my life to know the real kind, and this was the real kind. Near dawn, while Sandra had stepped away to find a bathroom, Harold, awake, tired, tethered to a monitor that beeped in a steady, reassuring rhythm, waved me closer to his bed with 2 fingers. "Harold, she told you something in the car." I didn't ask how he knew. Some marriages, you just know. "Harold, Sandra's mother had a long decline, years of it, and Sandra's father decided a teenage girl underfoot was too much to manage, so he shipped her off to family, on and off most of that last year. She wasn't in the house the night her mother died. She spent every year since then making sure nobody can ever say that about her again, making sure she's there, even when nobody's asked her to be." He looked at his own hands for a moment. "Harold, it's not an excuse. I've told her that myself, more than once, more than she's wanted to hear it. But it's the reason. I thought you should have the reason." I sat with him a while after that, not saying much, and when Sandra came back, I got up and let her have the chair. Around 6, I found her alone by the vending machines, holding a coffee she wasn't drinking. I stood beside her, and for a minute neither of us said anything at all. "Carol, I lost my husband 4 years ago. Heart, same as Harold, except his didn't give anyone a warning first." Sandra looked at me. "Carol, I understand wanting to be useful to the people you love so badly that you'll take up space that isn't yours, just to prove you're still needed. I understand it better than I'd like to. Sandra, I don't know how to just be a guest in anyone's life. I never learned that. Carol, Paige could teach you if you asked her to, instead of just moving her spice rack." It wasn't gentle exactly what I said, but it wasn't cruel either, and Sandra didn't flinch from it. She let out a breath that had clearly been sitting in her chest a long while, and for just a moment, standing under those terrible fluorescent lights, we weren't a daughter-in-law's mother and a son's mother circling each other over territory that belonged to neither of us. We were just 2 women who'd both, in our own ways, been frightened by exactly that kind of night, more than once in our lives. Something had shifted between us in that hallway. I didn't know yet how much it would matter a few days later when my son finally sat down with her and Harold to talk about when they'd be going home. Part 7. Harold came home that afternoon, worn out but steady, with a folder of discharge instructions and a new prescription bottle rattling in his jacket pocket. He grumbled the whole way home about hospital coffee, which Sandra took as an excellent sign, and so did the rest of us. The house was quieter after that night, in a way I don't think anyone could have explained out loud. Gentler, maybe, like everyone had been handed a reminder of how much smaller all the spice rack arguments were than they'd felt a week before, and how much bigger the people underneath them were. A few evenings later, Ryan and Paige sat down with Harold and Sandra in the living room. I wasn't part of that conversation. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and let them have the living room to themselves. Some rooms need to belong only to the people standing in them without an audience. I heard the rhythm of it more than the words. A long stretch of low, careful talking, a pause that went on just slightly too long, and then once, clear enough to carry into the kitchen, my son's voice, steadier than I'd heard it in weeks. This is Paige's home too, and it has been since the day we signed for it. That doesn't stop being true because you're family. And a little later, quieter, but just as clear, Paige, I love you both. I mean that. And I need you to ask before you move something in my house again, including me. I sat very still at that table and let myself cry a little for reasons I couldn't have fully explained even to myself. They set a date, that Saturday, giving everyone a few days to pack up and make the drive home to Farmville without rushing it. Nobody raised a voice from what I could tell. Nobody needed to by then. The next morning, over coffee, Paige told me more of it in her own words at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around the blue mug she always used. I told them I understood why they came, she said. I told them I was glad Dad's okay. And then I told them that this, all of it, the last 3 weeks, wasn't going to be how it worked going forward. That I loved having them visit. That I didn't love disappearing every time they walked through the door. She turned the mug slowly on the table. Mom didn't say much, but she didn't argue either. I think that's new. It is, I said. Harold and Sandra left that Saturday with Thanksgiving still more than a week away. Sandra cried a little at the door, and this time I understood exactly what those tears were made of, and I didn't think less of her for them. Harold shook my hand at the car and told me it had been a pleasure to meet me, and he meant it, the same unhurried, careful way he meant everything. Before she got in the car, Sandra turned back once. Paige, she said, sometime, will you teach me that pasta, the one without the wheat in it? It wasn't an apology exactly. It wasn't going to undo a lifetime of needing to be needed. But Paige said yes and meant it. And for a Saturday morning in November, that was enough. I stayed through the weekend. What had started as a 4-day visit had quietly become 10, and I didn't regret a single one of them. On Sunday morning, before either of them was awake, I made eggs and toast the way I used to when Ryan was small, and I wanted to get something useful done before the day could make its demands, and I left coffee in the blue mug on the counter and a note that said only, "See you next month." Driving home, the fields on either side of the highway were gray and flat and picked clean for winter, and I drove with the window cracked despite the cold, because I've always loved the particular smell of November, dead leaves and distance and the promise of a fire waiting at the end of a long drive. I thought about Paige on that back step with her mug, saying, I know it's not normal, I just don't know how to say it without a war. I thought about Sandra in that hospital hallway, telling me the truest thing she'd said all week to a woman she barely knew, because fear has a way of making honesty easier than it should be. I keep thinking about the spice rack. It sounds like such a small thing. A wooden rack, a dozen jars, moved 4 feet from one side of a stove to the other. But I've lived long enough to know the small things are never really about themselves. That rack was about who got to decide. And once Paige moved it back, quietly, without asking permission from anyone, something shifted that no conversation could have shifted on its own. I think about the cardinals that come back to that feeder every winter, the same pair, Paige told me once, choosing the same branch year after year, not because it's the only branch in the yard, but because it's theirs. I hope when they come back this year, she looks out that window and understands she taught herself something no one else could have taught her, that a home isn't the walls or the mortgage or even the people who help you buy it. It's every small, quiet choice you make inside it about what you're willing to let someone else decide for you and what you finally decide to keep.